The groan of the airliner's landing gear extending was the first sign that something was wrong. Eva Rostova woke not with a start, but with a slow, uncoiling awareness. The sleep she'd managed in seat 12B was shallow, a brief armistice with the exhaustion of a life she was trying to leave behind. She cracked an eyelid. Outside the small oval window, there was no city, no grid of welcoming lights, just a swirling ochre chaos. Sand. A storm of biblical proportions was raging, a maelstrom of dust and wind that turned the sky into a solid, impenetrable wall. The plane was crabbing hard against the crosswind, the engines whining in a register of protest she knew all too well. This wasn't a commercial approach. This was a combat landing. The captain's voice, strained but calm, crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a severe and unforecasted weather event, we have been diverted. We will be landing at Al Dafra Air Base. Please remain in your seats. A murmur of confusion rippled through the cabin. Al Dafra, a joint coalition base, not a tourist destination. Eva felt the familiar tension return to her shoulders, a phantom weight of the G-suit and helmet she no longer wore. She saw it in the razor wire perimeter that flashed past the window, in the hardened aircraft shelters hunkered against the sand, in the very air of organized emergency. They were deplaned not into a terminal, but a cavernous hangar where humid air, thick with the smell of jet fuel and ozone, clung to everything. An Air Force sergeant with a weary face directed the bewildered passengers towards a prefabricated briefing room, his voice barely audible over the howl of the wind battering the hangar doors. The crisis was not just the storm. It was a sound, a feeling in the air. The clipped, urgent voices on radios, the purposeful stride of uniformed personnel hurrying past the corralled civilians. Eva watched them, a ghost at the feast. She was a civilian now, in jeans and a worn leather jacket, just another passenger. But the instincts remained. Her eyes scanned the flight line, identifying the shapes of F-22s and KC-10s shrouded in protective tarps, their forms ghostly in the blowing sand. Then she saw it. Housed in a separate, heavily guarded bay, was a silhouette she knew better than her own. Angular, predatory, with engines that could vector and wings that could sweep. The XF-70 Whisperhawk. An experimental bird. A ghost that wasn't supposed to be here. A sudden, piercing tone cut through the hangar's ambient noise, followed by an announcement that silenced all conversation. Attention on the flight line. All non-essential personnel clear the area. Forward operating base Sentinel is Winchester. I repeat, FOB Sentinel is out of ammunition. Air support is grounded. This is a Priority 1 emergency, a moment of chilling silence. Then a second, more desperate broadcast. Urgent request. Any personnel, active or reserve, with flight experience on the XF-70 platform, report to the Tactical Operations Center immediately. The voice was young, strained. Eva closed her eyes. She had been running from that world for a year. It seemed the storm had chased her down. She moved before she had fully decided to, her body acting on years of ingrained duty. She slipped away from the huddle of passengers, her worn boots making no sound on the polished concrete floor as she walked toward the pulsating heart of the crisis. The guards at the TOC entrance saw a civilian and moved to block her, their hands instinctively going to their sidearms. She met their gaze without challenge, her voice quiet but firm. My name is Eva Rostova. I was summoned. The name meant nothing to them. But to the roaring crisis inside that room, it was the only answer that mattered. She pushed through the door, into a room of controlled chaos, stepping back into a life she thought she had buried. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the air was cold and stale, a stark contrast to the swirling furnace outside. Blue light from 24 monitors painted the tense faces of the men and women within. At the center of the room, a large screen showed a satellite feed of the storm, a monstrous, swirling comma of brown that covered half the country. In one corner, a smaller window displayed a flickering, grainy video feed from FOB Sentinel. Tracer fire stitched the darkness, and the frantic audio was a cacophony of explosions and shouting. Colonel Madsen stood before the main screen, his back ramrod straight, his jaw tight. He was a man carved from regulation, his uniform immaculate despite the unfolding disaster. He barked orders into a headset, his voice a low growl of authority fighting a losing battle against the inevitable. When Eva entered, he didn't notice her at first. She was a civilian anomaly in his sterile military world. A lieutenant intercepted her, his face a mask of polite skepticism. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. I need you to go back to the passenger waiting area." Eva's gaze remained fixed on Madsen. "I heard the announcement. I have time on the XF-70". Her voice was low, devoid of inflection, but it cut through the room's low hum. The lieutenant paused. Madsen finally turned, his eyes narrowing as they took in her civilian attire. He looked less like a pilot and more like someone who had just stepped off a cross-country bus. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice laced with impatience. "Get her out of here." "Colonel," Eva said, stepping forward. Her calm was a quiet island in the room's turbulent sea. "My name is Eva Rostova. I have over 400 hours in the XF-70 prototype. I was on the original test and evaluation team at Edwards." Madsen's expression flickered from annoyance to disbelief. He gestured to an analyst. "Pull up her file." Now he turned back to Eva, his eyes raking over her, searching for the lie. "For 100 hours? That's more than the program director. I flew the high-G and zero-visibility envelope trials," she stated simply, as if reciting a grocery list. "I know it's breaking points," the analyst at the console swore under his breath. "Sir, she's telling the truth. Captain Eva Rostova. Call sign Valkyrie. Decorated. But she's on the inactive list, sir. Grounded. Pending a final medical review for vestibular trauma." Madsen's face hardened, his initial disbelief solidifying into a rigid wall of protocol. "Inactive," he repeated, the word a final judgment. "Grounded. That means you are not certified to fly. Not for this Air Force. Not in my sector." He turned his back on her, a clear dismissal. "I can't put a grounded pilot, regardless of her history, into a $200 million experimental asset during a Category 5 sandstorm to attempt an impossible rescue. The risk is unacceptable. The regulations are clear." He pointed a finger at the lieutenant. "Get her out." "I don't have time for this." The comms from FOB Sentinel crackled again. A young voice, tight with fear. "TOC, this is Sentinel. They're at the southern wall. We can't hold them. We need that ammo. Is anyone coming?" Madsen closed his eyes, the weight of the decision crushing him. Eva didn't move. She just stood there, watching him, her silence a heavier presence than any argument she could have made. She knew the language of men like Madsen. Regulation was their shield. But she also knew the language of desperation, and it was screaming from every monitor in the room. The comms from FOB Sentinel went dead. A hiss of static filled the TOC, a sound more terrifying than any scream. Madsen slammed his fist on the console. "Get them back. Get me a sitrep." But there was only silence. The red icon for the FOB on the main map blinked once, twice, then shifted to a stark, ominous amber. Contact lost. The room held its breath. It wasn't over yet, but the end was closing in. It was in that suffocating silence that a young airman first class, a crew chief named Garcia, stepped hesitantly forward. He had been quietly working at a side terminal, his face pale. "Colonel Madsen, sir," he stammered, holding up a data slate. "Permission to speak." Madsen shot him a withering glare. "What is it, airman?" Garcia swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Eva. "Sir, I was stationed at Edwards during the Whisperhawk trials. I worked on her bird," he gestured with the slate. "Captain Rostova. Valkyrie. We heard stories. I pulled up the telemetry from test flight 3B Alpha. The storm simulation." He tapped the screen, and a wireframe graphic filled the slate's display. It showed the XF-70 moving through a simulated weather cell so violent the program's parameters had classified it as non-survivable. The aircraft on the screen danced. It didn't just fly. It flowed through the chaos, its movements economical, precise, impossible. "No other pilot could hold it in the sim," Garcia whispered, his voice full of awe. She flew it for 12 minutes. Landed it blind on a carrier deck with 2 simulated engine failures. Madsen stared at the data, then at Eva. The rigid certainty in his posture began to crumble, eroded by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. Desperation was a powerful catalyst. The rulebook was written for a world with options. He had none left. He looked at the amber icon for Sentinel, then back at the woman in the leather jacket. He saw no ego in her eyes, no plea for validation. He saw only a calm, unnerving readiness. "Fine," he bit out, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "The bird is yours," he jabbed a finger in her direction. "But you are a civilian asset under my command. You will follow my orders to the letter. Get the package on the ground and you egress immediately. No heroics, Rostova. Am I clear?" Eva simply nodded. "Perfectly." She turned and walked out of the TOC, Garcia hurrying to keep pace. "This way, ma'am," he said, leading her toward the Whisperhawk's hangar. The bay doors were sealed against the storm, but the wind shrieked through the seams. Inside, the aircraft sat under harsh floodlights, a symphony of dark, composite angles. Eva walked toward it, her stride measured. Garcia had already pulled a flight suit and helmet from a locker. "It's a standard medium, ma'am. Best I could find on short notice." She took it without a word, her focus entirely on the machine before her. She changed quickly, the familiar ritual of zipping zippers and fastening straps a comforting muscle memory. The suit was a little tight across the shoulders, a little loose at the waist, but it was a second skin she had missed more than she cared to admit. She picked up a pair of flight gloves from a workbench, the leather worn smooth and thin over the knuckles, scarred with the ghosts of 1,000 switches and controls. They were her own. She'd kept them in her carry-on, a final, foolish relic of a former life. As she pulled them on, a small patch on the flight suit's sleeve caught her eye, a generic squadron insignia. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, circular patch of her own. It was faded, the threads worn. On it was a single black raven in flight, its wings spread against a field of gray. A memento from her mentor, the man who taught her to feel the air, not just fly through it. With practiced motions, she stitched it on over the other patch with a needle and thread from a maintenance kit. She was no longer just a pilot. She was Valkyrie again. Her final preparation was for the aircraft itself. She didn't just do a walk around. She communed with it. Her gloved hand ran along the leading edge of the wing, feeling for imperfections. She touched the cold ceramic of the engine nacelles, her fingers tracing the seams. She wasn't looking at a machine. She was looking at an extension of herself, a temperamental partner she had once known intimately. Her touch was a question, a greeting, a reminder. The Whisperhawk was no longer just an asset. It was her bird. The cockpit of the XF-70 was a familiar darkness, a cramped cathedral of glass and metal that smelled faintly of ozone and recycled air. Eva settled into the ejection seat, the contours molding to her form as if she had never left. The storm raged against the canopy, the sound a deafening, continuous roar of a billion grains of sand trying to scour the world clean. It was chaos outside, but inside, there was only the quiet focus of the mission. Her hands moved with an economy born of instinct, flicking switches, tapping screens. The cockpit bloomed to life around her, panels glowing with soft green and amber light. "APU start," she murmured, her voice a low hum that was part of the machine's own awakening. The auxiliary power unit whined to life, a prelude to the thunder to come. RCS check, magnetic clamps green, inlet shields nominal. Each step in the sequence was a wordless prayer, a catechism she had memorized in her bones. Colonel Madsen's voice crackled in her ear, tinny and strained. "Rostova, your flight window is 22 minutes before the storm's eye wall collapses on Sentinel's position. It's a one-way ticket if you're not out by then. Drop the resupply pallet and egress. That is your only objective." His voice carried the weight of a man sending a soldier to a near-certain death, a weight he hadn't wanted but now had to bear. "Understood, Colonel," Eva replied, her voice betraying no emotion. Her focus was absolute. She could feel the aircraft through the stick, a low thrum of potential energy waiting to be unleashed. The hangar doors began to grind open, revealing a wall of roiling brown fury. The wind howled into the bay, a physical presence that shook the 200-ton aircraft. "Valkyrie is green for vertical takeoff," she announced, her voice steady. She didn't wait for a reply. Her hand pushed the throttle forward. The twin engines spooled up, their deep rumble vibrating through her chest, escalating to a ground-shaking roar that drowned out even the storm. The Whisper Hawk lifted off the ground, not with the grace of an airplane, but with the brutal power of a rocket. It rose 10 feet, 20 feet, hovering with impossible stability in the maelstrom of the open hangar. Sand and grit blasted against the canopy. Visibility was zero. She saw nothing but a churning, opaque curtain of sand. She was flying blind, her world reduced to the glowing lines of the synthetic vision on her heads-up display and the deep, reassuring thrum of the engines under her control. She nosed the aircraft forward, leaving the relative shelter of the hangar and plunging directly into the heart of the beast. The Whisper Hawk shuddered violently as it met the full force of the wind. Warning indicators flashed on her console: wind shear, pitot tube icing, atmospheric pressure alerts. She silenced them one by one, her inputs on the control subtle, precise, preemptive. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was dancing with it, yielding to its power in one moment, then using its own energy to her advantage in the next. She was a ghost in a hurricane, a whisper in a scream, flying an impossible machine into an unsurvivable sky. Breaking through the storm wall was like being born. One moment, she was in a suffocating, violent abyss of brown noise and shaking metal. The next, she was in the eerie calm of the storm's eye. Below her, FOB Sentinel was a scene from hell. The small, fortified compound was an island in a sea of darkness, illuminated by the hellish orange light of burning vehicles and the frantic, pulsing strobes of muzzle flashes. The perimeter was breached in 3 places. Enemy technicals, armed with heavy machine guns, were pouring fire into the last defensive positions. The planned drop zone, a small, open area near the main gate, was completely overrun. The red smoke marking the LZ was drifting over a swarm of enemy fighters. Matson's voice was sharp in her ear, the relief of her survival immediately replaced by tactical reality. "Valkyrie, you see the situation. The LZ is compromised. It's a kill box. Abort the drop. I repeat, abort the drop and return to base." That's an order. He was pulling her out, cutting his losses. The defenders on the ground were already dead. He wouldn't sacrifice his last asset and its pilot for a lost cause. The rulebook was clear. You don't throw good money after bad. Eva's eyes scanned the battlefield, her mind processing the chaos with cold, inhuman speed. She saw the last pocket of resistance, a handful of soldiers huddled behind a burned-out transport vehicle near the center of the compound. They were firing disciplined bursts, conserving the last of their ammunition. They were professionals selling their lives dearly. "Negative, Colonel," she replied, her voice a flat line of defiance. "I have a solution." Before Madsen could respond, she acted. Aborting was not an option. Returning to the rulebook was not an option. She pushed the stick forward, diving the Whisperhawk not towards the compromised drop zone, but toward the very heart of the last stand. The aircraft, designed for stealthy, high-altitude penetration, screamed toward the ground. Alarms blared in the cockpit. Altitude, proximity, overspeed. She ignored them all. Instead of a high-altitude, parachute-assisted pallet drop, she was going to deliver the package by hand. She pulled back hard at the last second, the G-force pressing her deep into her seat. The Whisperhawk's engines swiveled downwards, their vectoring thrust biting into the turbulent air. The massive aircraft bled speed with impossible efficiency, transitioning from a hypersonic dive to a stable, near-motionless hover 50 feet above the courtyard. The wind inside the storm's eye was still a gale, and holding the aircraft steady was like balancing a needle on the head of a pin. But she held it. Below, both friend and foe stopped firing for a stunned second, their faces upturned at the sudden appearance of the dark, silent angel of death hanging above them. In the TOC, Madsen and his team watched, breathless, on the drone feed. "What is she doing?" someone whispered. Eva's fingers danced across a control panel. "Releasing payload," she said, her voice calm. The belly of the Whisperhawk opened, and a single, large crate of ammunition and medical supplies detached, not dropped, but lowered on a stabilized winch, descending with gentle precision into the small circle of defenders. Touched the ground without a sound. It was a maneuver of such audacious, impossible skill that for a moment, the battle ceased to exist. It was a single, perfect act that had just flipped the entire board. The enemy's shock lasted only a moment. It was replaced by a furious, concentrated rage. They had been denied their victory by a ghost from the sky, and now they turned all their firepower on the machine that had thwarted them. Heavy machine gun fire raked the Whisperhawk's fuselage, the rounds sparking harmlessly off its advanced composite armor. But they were adapting. A group of fighters near the breached southern wall scrambled to set up a new weapon, a tripod-mounted system Eva recognized instantly. A man-portable air defense system. They hadn't expected air support in the storm, but they were prepared. "Valkyrie, heads up. Manpad's team, south wall." The warning came from the FOB's commander, his voice a grateful, urgent shout over the comms. They had the resupply crate open, frantically reloading magazines. She had given them hope, and now they were trying to protect her. A high-pitched tone screamed in Eva's cockpit. A missile lock. A red diamond symbol flashed on her HUD, centered on the aircraft. In the TOC, the mood shifted from awe to terror. "Rostova, you have a missile launch. Break off. Evasive maneuvers now." Madsen's voice had lost all its detached authority. It was a plea. He was no longer a colonel commanding an asset. He was a man watching a pilot he had sent into the fire about to be consumed by it. The trust was no longer reluctant. It was absolute, forged in the crucible of her impossible first action. He was with her now, living every second in the cockpit from his sterile command room 100 miles away. "I see it," was Eva's only reply. Her voice was preternaturally calm. Breaking off wasn't her style. Evasion was a defensive move. She preferred to attack. The enemy fighter shouldered the launcher, and a streak of white-hot fire erupted, corkscrewing through the dark sky directly toward her. Instead of firewalling the throttle and climbing for safety, Eva did the one thing the missile's guidance system was not programmed to anticipate. She cut the power. Not throttled back, but a full, dead-stick engine cutoff. The Whisperhawk, deprived of its lift, fell from the sky like a stone. The 200-ton machine dropped with the brutal, unforgiving acceleration of gravity. Inside the cockpit, Eva was thrown against her straps, the negative GS threatening to pull her from her seat. Outside, the missile, tracking the massive heat signature of her engines, suddenly found its target gone. The heat source was plummeting, but the missile's primitive brain, programmed for the trajectory of a fleeing aircraft, couldn't compute the sudden vertical drop. It overshot, streaking through the empty space where the Whisperhawk had been a split second before, and detonated harmlessly against the far canyon wall. The ground rushed up to meet her. The proximity alarm was a solid, unrelenting shriek. Madsen was shouting in her ear, a stream of unintelligible noise. She ignored it all. Her eyes were fixed on her instruments, her hand poised over the throttle. This was the razor's edge, the place where test pilots lived and died. She waited, letting the aircraft fall, counting the seconds, feeling the moment in her bones. 50 feet, 40, 30. Now, she slammed the throttle forward and hit the ignition. The engines re-engaged with a deafening, explosive roar. The controlled detonation of fuel and air was channeled through the vectoring nozzles, which she kicked hard to the right. The Whisperhawk didn't just stop falling. It pirouetted, the tail whipping sideways as the full power of its engines blasted it parallel to the ground. It was a high-G, terrain-hugging maneuver that flattened her into her seat. Using the compound walls and surrounding rock formations for cover, she leveled out just 10 feet off the deck, a black wraith screaming through the battlefield. The signature move was complete. and it had given her a clear line of sight. As she flashed past the southern wall, she toggled her weapons system. The aircraft's 30mm nose cannon, silent until now, spun to life. She squeezed the trigger. A single 3-second burst of high-explosive rounds, perfectly aimed, tore through the air. The Manpad's team and their launcher vanished in a cloud of dust and fire. She hadn't just dodged the bullet. She had eliminated the gun. With the immediate threat neutralized and the defenders resupplied, the momentum of the battle shifted dramatically. The soldiers of FOB Sentinel, fighting with renewed vigor, began pushing the attackers back from the breaches, their disciplined fire now replenished and overwhelming. But the cost had been high. A new call came from the ground, this one from the team's medic. "TOC, Valkyrie, we have a critical casualty. Sergeant Evans. Multiple GSWs to the chest, he's fading fast. We need immediate evac. I can't stabilize him here." The storm was still a churning wall of sand around the small pocket of calm, making a traditional helicopter medevac impossible. There were no other options. There was only Eva. "I'm on my way," she said, her voice betraying the first hint of warmth. This was the part of the job that mattered. Not the flying, not the fighting. She banked the Whisperhawk, circling the compound once, her eyes scanning for a viable landing zone. There was none. The courtyard was littered with debris and burning wreckage. Every flat surface was a death trap. "I can't set her down," she transmitted, her mind racing through the aircraft's performance specs, weighing risks and possibilities. She looked at the main command building, a 2-story structure with a flat, reinforced roof. It was narrow, barely wider than the Whisperhawk's landing gear. "Sentinel Command. What's the status of your roof?" The FOB commander's voice came back instantly. "Solid concrete. It'll hold your weight. But there isn't enough room for a full landing." "I don't need a full landing," Eva replied. "Clear the west wall. I can do a skid touch extraction." A murmur of disbelief went through the TOC. A skid touch was a maneuver for light helicopters, a delicate balancing act. Attempting it in a massive experimental strike fighter, in gusting, unpredictable winds, was suicidal. But Madsen didn't question her. He simply said, "Sentinel, you heard her. Clear the west wall. Move on the ground." The soldiers scrambled, providing suppressing fire while the medic and 2 others carried the wounded Sergeant Evans on a stretcher up to the roof. Eva brought the Whisperhawk around, approaching the building low and slow, fighting the crosswinds with constant minute adjustments. She lowered the landing gear, but only the rear skids. She eased the aircraft sideways, crab-walking it until the rear landing struts were just feet from the building's edge. With a surgeon's precision, she gently lowered the aircraft until the 2 rear skids made contact with the concrete parapet. The front of the Whisperhawk hung in the air, its engines screaming as they held it perfectly level. The transfer was terrifyingly fast. The soldiers pushed the stretcher into the small cargo bay behind the cockpit, securing it in seconds. As they scrambled back, Eva pivoted the nose cannon and laid down a withering field of fire on enemy positions that were trying to target the exposed rooftop. With the wounded soldier safely aboard, she pushed the throttle, lifting away from the building as smoothly as she had arrived. She had become their shield, their transport, their avenging angel all in one. The flight back to Aldafra was silent. The storm was finally breaking, its fury spent. To the east, the first hint of dawn painted a thin, violet line across the horizon. Eva flew on autopilot, the machine humming contentedly around her. The tension in her shoulders began to recede, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. She had danced with the storm and won. She had stared death in the face and made it blink. Now all that was left was the quiet aftermath. She landed the Whisperhawk with a whisper-soft touch on the main runway, the sand-scoured airframe looking like a warrior returned from some mythic battle. The engines whined down into silence, a sound that left a ringing void in the newfound morning quiet. As she unstrapped herself and opened the canopy, the cool, clean desert air felt like a benediction. On the tarmac below, a medical team was already rushing to the aircraft to retrieve Sergeant Evans. And standing beside them, waiting for her, was Colonel Madsen. He wasn't flanked by military police, ready to arrest her for insubordination and stealing an experimental jet. He was alone. Eva climbed down the ladder, her movements stiff. She pulled off her helmet, her hair matted with sweat. She met Madsen's gaze, expecting a reprimand, a court-martial, the final, bureaucratic end to her career. Madsen said nothing. He simply looked at her, then at the magnificent, scarred machine she had flown, and then back at her. He raised his hand to his brow in a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture of a superior officer. It was a mark of profound, unadulterated respect. The highest honor a man like him knew how to give. Specialist Garcia was there, too, holding the worn leather jacket she'd left behind. He offered it to her with a shy, reverent smile. He had watched the entire mission on a comms feed in the hangar, his belief in her vindicated beyond his wildest dreams. He glanced down at the raven patch on her sleeve, which was now caked with dust. "My grandfather was a crew chief on the old State Route 71 project," Garcia said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "He used to tell me stories about the test pilots at Edwards, the ones who flew the impossible birds. He told me about Valkyrie." He looked up, his eyes shining. "He said you were a legend." I guess he was right. The name, her call sign, hung in the air between them. It was no longer just a word from a file. It was a truth that had been proven in fire and wind. Eva just nodded, too tired for words, accepting the jacket and the legacy that came with it. She changed back into her civilian clothes in a small, quiet locker room, the borrowed flight suit feeling alien and heavy. She was anonymous again, just another passenger on a diverted flight. As she walked across the tarmac toward the terminal where the other travelers were slowly being organized for a new departure, she felt a strange sense of dislocation, as if the last few hours had been a hyper-real dream. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the flight line. Madsen intercepted her one last time before she reached the building. He wasn't wearing his formal command expression. His face was etched with a weary gratitude. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it. He held out a military data slate. "We received a priority message from the Pentagon an hour ago. It seems your heroics didn't go unnoticed." Eva took the slate. On the screen was a single document, her official service record. She scrolled down to the bottom line. The text read, "Inactive status, pending medical review." As she watched, the line flickered, and new text appeared in its place. "Active duty status, reinstated. Flight certification, all platforms. Immediate effect. Your file has been updated," Madsen said simply. "Your inactive status has been corrected. Your wings are your own again, Captain." She looked from the screen to the colonel's face, 1,000 unspoken things passing between them. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, the only acknowledgement he needed. It was more than thanks. It was an acceptance. She handed the slate back to him and turned to leave. Her flight was boarding. Her new life, or perhaps her old one, was waiting. Before she disappeared back into the anonymity of the crowd, she paused. She walked back to the Whisperhawk, which sat cooling in the morning sun, its dark skin streaked with sand. She reached out and laid her palm flat against its fuselage. The composite material was still warm, humming with a residual energy, a silent memory of their shared ordeal. It felt less like metal and more like flesh and bone. A quiet moment of connection between the pilot and her machine. Then, she pulled her hand away, turned her back on the war, and walked into the sunrise, a quiet warrior whose dignity needed no audience, no applause. Just the sky, the wind, and the silent respect of those who had witnessed the impossible.